Thankfully, largely gone are the days of running out of lives and continues in video games and having to start from scratch from the title screen. The advent of autosaves and checkpoints has improved all of our lives. Now, placing checkpoints is not an art form. In theory, it's very simple. In practice, well, the games on this list prove that that's not always the case. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 most unforgiving checkpoints in video game history. Number 10. Prologue, near Automata. To start this list off, we need to begin with a checkpoint that is quite literally the game's main menu. Near Automata has a 45-minute long prologue where, if you die at any time, it's back to literal square one. The abandoned factory section is an absolute tour de force for the game, a long surprising shoot-em-up section to kick things off, some exciting battles, and then a showdown with a gigantic imposing boss. If you're the type to turn your nose up at playing anything on normal or below, then you'll be asked to back that claim up. The whole game is brutal on hard, and the prologue is no exception. A first boss that can one-shot you should really say it all. To make matters worse, whether you're able to get through the prologue in one go is really important. If you fall, you'll be going through each part again, complete with lots of dialogue sections, since the first save is 3/4 of an hour into the game. Although hilariously, if you want to get a 100% run of Nier Automata, you need to die in the prologue at least once to get one of the hidden endings. Just maybe do it as soon as possible and not right at the end of one of the most grueling openings in video game history. Number 9. The Library, Halo. You've probably heard this one before, but the checkpointing system in Halo's library level can get onto a Covenant Corvette and fly directly into the sun. Unanimously agreed as the worst level in not just the first Halo game, but also in the franchise's 20-year history, the library sees Master Chief attempting to traverse a long winding stream of metallic hallways as he is constantly under attack from the Flood. It's a painfully long level that basically stops the first Halo from being literally perfect. The checkpoint system is the real issue because it causes this already long corridor to feel never-ending. The Flood are not just the infected monstrosities that come running at you, but there's also some that are just irritating popcorn-shaped spores. These things can easily go amiss, lost in the dark and stuck in the geometry, and with an encounter not technically over, if there's still one out there, then a new autosave might not occur. This is bad enough, but it gets worse because it's not like that's how every checkpoint in the stage works. Some only pop if the player reaches a certain point in the level, and Flood will spawn endlessly until they do. It's a damn mess. Do you want players to fight all of them or none of them, Halo? Pick one. Number 8. Faison Mines, Metroid Prime. Faison Mines is the last major area of Metroid Prime and is the base on Talon 4 for the villainous space pirates. The first save station for the mines is right at the start, and the area is a long slog through 25 minutes of winding rooms filled with enemies and multiple traversal puzzles, so it's a must to use this, especially because that's all you get before facing the Cloaked Drone. This boss is one of the most hated enemies in the Prime series, an invisible sentry that throws out a lot of what the player has grown used to. The game has expressly told players to scan every new enemy and artifact to shoot for that 100%, but the Cloaked Drone can't be scanned at all, so players who get here for the first time might wind up dying before even firing off a shot. Furthermore, the drone's invisibility means it can't be locked onto by Samus's gun, unlike every other enemy in the title. And if you do die, well, have fun navigating the entire mine again. Metroid Prime's lack of checkpoints is definitely a your mileage may vary affair based on your difficulty preference, but at the very least 2021's Dread gave players an autosave before bosses so that they could jump right back in. This feature really should have been added to Metroid Prime Remastered, but as it stands, veterans don't dare approach this boss fight without picking up the Wave Buster beforehand so that they can stand a chance at all. Number 7. Evray, Final Fantasy X. The battle against Evray on the airship Fahrenheit can become a kind of soft lock for Final Fantasy X players who simply aren't ready to take on the boss. RPGs and the grind go hand in hand. Some players will overlevel their characters so that they can cruise through a game, and some won't put nearly enough time into it, and that's fine because for the most part you can stop at any time to work on your levels. And it is possible to level up on the Fahrenheit, thankfully, though it's not ideal. But if you saved here before the battle, then too bad, it's all you've got. Of course, a first playthrough can really turn into a nightmare here, since Yuna, the game's healer, has just left the party, and it leaves players struggling to fill that gap. Evray is no pushover either, having elemental resistance, status ailment inducing attacks, and the ability to move out of range, forcing players to command the airship closer or further to attack or defend. Worst of all, beating the boss isn't necessarily the end point, as the airship touches down in Bavel and the party is thrown into a series of fights before they even have a chance to save. Die here and it's back to Evray's poison breath you go. Number 6, tip of the iceberg, Gears of War. What does Augustus Cole say when he goes down the chilled drinks aisle at his local supermarket?
Look at all that juice.
What does Coltrane say when pouring off the liquids from cooking a beautiful beef brisket?
Look at all that juice.
What does Mr. Cole say to G up his friends when they're looking good?
Look at all that juice.
And what does he say over and over again when you die and have to start the same checkpoint ad infinitum? You probably get the picture by now. The only disadvantage about game dialogue taking place outside of controller stealing full-on cutscenes is those moments where you have to hear it repeatedly. Gears of War, unfortunately, is heavy on this kind of in-game storytelling, and there are several conversations that players are likely to hear repeatedly, especially on higher difficulties. Without a doubt, the worst is the pumping station in Act 3's Tip of the Iceberg chapter, where players encounter a squad of Theron guards with one-hit kill-capable torque bows. Hearing this phrase over and over didn't just become a meme amongst fans, but also other developers. Dead Rising 2 pays homage with an achievement titled Look at All That Juice, and even quite recently, Halo Infinite included a cheeky reference on a visor cosmetic called Juice, and it all began as one infuriating checkpoint. Number 5, Riku, Kingdom Hearts. Hearing the same single line time and time again is bad enough, but truly the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of bad checkpoints are those that are placed before unskippable cutscenes. What appeared on the surface to be a cutesy JRPG with Disney characters, Kingdom Hearts turned out to be a wildly complex story about hearts, keys, friendship, and betrayal. And that's just the first game, which feels quite quaint compared to the bombastic nature of all the others. A particularly important and human thread throughout Kingdom Hearts is the complex relationship between Sora and Riku, which comes to a head later in the game when they're both fighting for different sides. The two face off against each other in a Keyblade battle that's one of the toughest bosses in the title, no question. Which makes it particularly irritating when Riku beats your face in, as he is likely to do, and you have to sit through the setup once more. 2 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but no gamer wants to spend their precious free time being forced to watch the same 2 minutes over and over again. Thankfully, later reiterations made this boss battle much more manageable, and perhaps more importantly, added in the ability to skip cutscenes. Number 4, Central Yharnam, Bloodborne. From Software games and bashing one's head against a metaphorical wall until you break through have become part and parcel with each other. After all, Dark Souls and its community really popularised the get good mentality and phrasing that makes many players afraid to admit where they've struggled, especially if that's the early game. When they're dropped into Central Yharnam, gamers must fight their way through enemies with very few checkpoints along the way, meaning when you die, which you are bound to do, you must trek quite the way back to your previous point. It's certainly a lesson that players need to learn, but it seems extra cruel to do this in what is essentially the game's first area, not to mention tucking away the checkpoint before Father Gascoigne's boss fight out of the way so that many players actually miss it. As for the other boss, the cleric beast, the closest lantern is actually on the other side of the fight, so you might find yourself becoming very familiar with the layout of Yharnam, shortcuts or no. Number 3, End of the World, Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. This revival of Sonic the Hedgehog was supposed to revitalise the franchise, but instead nearly killed it. Most players will back out of the game after very little time with the bug-laden affair, so getting to the end of the world is a real test of patience and probably masochism. This final stage is similar to Canon's Core, the last hurrah of the legendary Sonic Adventure 2, where players cycle through taking control of every character. As the ultimate test, both stages are tough by design. The major difference is that Canon's Core has a checkpoint at least between each character. It's hard, but ultimately doable. End of the World, in keeping with the BS of Sonic 2006, has absolutely no checkpoints whatsoever. You can get to the final 7th section as Shadow, die, and go all the way back to the beginning. And of course, like the rest of the game, it's plagued with glitches and nonsense, meaning that you can play your hardest and still die via means outside your control. It is the foul icing on top of the bland and festering cake that is Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, so in that way, it's the perfect send-off for the game. Number 2, Magatsu Inaba and Mandala, Persona 4. With Persona 3 and 4 recently launching onto modern systems, new fans of the the franchise have been able to go back and realise just how good they've had it in P5. As great as these games are, they are certainly products of their time. Persona 3's one gigantic dungeon is tedious compared to Persona 5's exciting locales, and Persona 4's final area is extremely punishing. The game's final dungeons, stacked back to back, are home to some truly aggressive enemies. Although exploring Megatsu Inaba and Megatsu Mandala isn't too bad, it's time consuming, taking probably around 90 minutes depending on how frequent and how long your enemy encounters tend to be. However, the issue is that between these two different areas there isn't a single checkpoint. For whatever reason, if you die on the final floor of Mandala, then you're sent back to the start of Inaba. And you don't even have to die. Some enemies are just able to send you back to the start by touch. Add in a few mini-bosses along the way and that's bad enough, but it somehow gets worse. At the end of this journey is a ton of classic JRPG exposition spread around the two final battles, again all with no autosave whatsoever. Fall here and you go right back to several hours ago. Brutal. And number 1, every level, Resistance Fall of Man. Over the last few decades, video games' most prominent genres have been whittled down to a science. There's just some things that you are expected to do when developing a title, some things that are considered the bare minimum. For FPS games, it's frequent autosave placements. When Resistance Fall of Man launched, it was met with decently high praise, but it might be time to argue that it hasn't aged well. Still, it's hardly Insomniac Games' fault that Call of Duty 4 was just around the corner, which would play a huge hand in standardising FPS controls and practices. However, there were issues at the time which are even starker in the harsh light of today. The checkpoint system feels positively unfinished. Each of Resistance's 11 missions only has a couple of worthwhile checkpoints each, turning the 12-hour campaign into one fraught with stress. It's so easy to find yourself playing massive sections again and again because you made a mistake or were overwhelmed by enemies, which is very likely due to the game dumping an entire military convoy's worth of baddies on you ad nauseum. There are sometimes multiple autosaves in a row when nothing is occurring, and other times you'll fight for 40 minutes without one popping. Halo's checkpoints were bad and confusing, but 5 years later, Resistance Fall of Man wasn't faring any better. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. Which of these games' checkpoints infuriated you the most, and of course let us know of any others that we didn't include. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.